Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and this week we continue our two-part series on the forthcoming book, In COVID's Wake, by Princeton professors Frances Lee and Stephen Macedo. Last week, we spoke with Professor Lee and focused on the external impacts of policy choices in the COVID era. We touched into the importance of conducting a critical analysis or post-mortem on the system, regardless of party or political association, and the ambiguity that can arise in scientific research, and how that was or was not dealt with and communicated within the COVID context. This week, we will be speaking with co-author Stephen Macedo to further understand the internal mechanisms of how key messages about the pandemic were inhibited or changed, and for unclear purposes. We discuss the paper trail of internal communications that contradict published articles regarding the origin of the COVID virus and the environment of science surrounding the effectiveness of masking. Professor Macedo gives us more details about the critique of specific experts in the COVID crisis, but maintains that experts and expertise is an integral part of nonpartisan deliberation. Finally, at the end of our two-part series, we discuss what steps or strategies you can use to keep your head above the overwhelm of conflicting information in a crisis like the COVID one. So thanks for tuning in. Let's welcome Professor Stephen Macedo to the show. Well, Professor Macedo, welcome to Madison's Notes.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you.
Yeah, I'm really interested. We were able to speak with Professor Lee last week, and just to open up, we asked her a little bit about her personal experiences and what brought her to write the book, but I want to ask you something similar as far as the motivations that drove you to collect this book and do this analysis and the importance that you see it playing in this present moment.
Yes, well, thank you. So what led me to it was that I had in mind a slightly broader take in a way. I was interested in, of course, the current moment of political polarization, as almost all political scientists are, and citizens. And one thing I've thought for a while is that progressive arguments on various public policy issues often fall short in some ways because they don't take seriously arguments on the other side of the political spectrum. So I had it in mind to write a book making that more general argument, focusing on immigration, on abortion, which I think has become in some ways more polarized than it used to be when progressives admitted that it was a hard issue, and COVID. But once I started in with the COVID policy issues, which obviously were more immediate and urgent when I started working on this in 2022, it quickly became clear that there was more than enough there. And so I decided to focus just on COVID. And I was talking to Professor Lee about it from the start, but we were not co-authoring the book. I had a draft of about 100 pages, and we did a workshop together in April 2023, I guess it was. And after that, I was delighted that she decided to co-author with me, and I've enjoyed working with her very much. But so it was that somewhat more general concern, obviously with COVID policy itself, which was hugely important, biggest global crisis since World War II, the biggest pandemic in a century. But for me, it was part of a kind of larger concern about our politics and partisanship and polarization, and my worry that, or I should say conviction that academic arguments can be inflected by this partisanship as well. And we would do better to take seriously arguments of people on the other side of the spectrum.
Now, as far as the conversation that we had with Professor Lee last week, we discussed the polarizing effects of the health administrations and what that meant for citizens. And we looked a little bit more at the impact of that on the public. Specifically, we talked about the World Health Organization visit to Wuhan in 2020, January, and the global response sort of through the end of 2020, early 2021. And so just as a little recap for our listeners, I'd love to remind ourselves, like, what did follow the science mean before the pandemic versus what did it mean during the pandemic and as it progressed later through the end of 2020 into 2021?
Okay, yeah, I'll answer that with respect to the pandemic specifically. One of the things that was really enlightening, I think, in working on this project was to look at pandemic planning documents before COVID. They were major plans devised. Two big ones were updated in 2019, just months before the COVID pandemic. One was by the World Health Organization in itself in the late summer or fall of 2019, surveying the range of non-pharmaceutical interventions. That's everything except the vaccines and drug treatments. So it included all the social distancing measures, school closures, business restrictions, stay-at-home orders, border closures, contact tracing, and so on. And that report said that the evidence supporting all of these measures was weak, and they would be of uncertain effectiveness. That report also emphasized that they would be costly to implement these measures in society for an extended period of time, and that policymakers should carefully consider the costs before imposing these measures. I mean, similarly, a Johns Hopkins report on pandemic planning document over the summer of 2019 surveyed all of the relevant evidence from previous reports and all of the published evidence on the effectiveness of these non-pharmaceutical interventions, and similarly found that the evidence supporting them was weak, and that, however, it was predictable that they would be costly, and that public officials needed to be careful and communicate honestly with the public about those costs before imposing them. And there are many other documents along these lines. In 2011, the UK did a pandemic planning document, and that document says that these non-pharmaceutical measures, again, don't have much evidence to support them. And because of the quick spread of respiratory viruses with short incubation periods that are highly transmissible, as if they had foreseen COVID, but this is true of respiratory viruses often in general, these measures would not even be useful in buying time. And that's quoting that document. So the pre-COVID pandemic plans are pretty consistent in expressing doubt about whether these measures would be successful, but being quite clear in predicting that they would be costly and that the costs needed to be taken into account. I would say that there was a cohort of scientists who were more optimistic about these non-pharmaceutical interventions, and they were mathematical modelers whose work was initiated under the George W. Bush administration in 2005, after President Bush read John Barry's The Great Influenza about the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. Bush became alarmed and concerned about the likelihood at some point of another pandemic. It was also in the wake of 9/11 and the terrorist attacks. So possibly there was a national security component to this as well. But he initiated a serious planning exercise calling for the spending of billions of dollars on pandemic plans and preparedness. And a central role in that was played by mathematical modelers who, based on these models but limited empirical evidence, argued that targeted layered interventions, school closures being the most important of them, business closures and other measures, social distancing measures, pandemic mortality and morbidity, serious illness and death could be reduced quite a lot. In fact, they said that simply closing schools firmly and keeping children at home socially isolated could reduce pandemic deaths by as much as 50% by itself. So they were influential. But the National Institutes of Medicine, the Institute of Medicine, which became later on the National Institute of Medicine, commissioned a study of these models and other pandemic plans, and quite a distinguished group. Actually, it was led by Dr. Adel Mahmoud, who was a professor here at Princeton at the time. He had been an epidemiologist and involved in drug manufacturing, but he was teaching in the policy school in the mid first decade of the 2000s. And he led this report, and they refused to endorse these measures. They found a limited evidence for them. They found that there were better explanations for what happened in the 1918-19 flu pandemic. And they also emphasized just what I said before, that these measures would be costly, of doubtful effectiveness, and that those costs needed to be communicated very clearly to the public, even noting that public officials in a time of pandemic crisis would feel pressure to do something, to seem to be in charge, to take control, to act, even in the absence of good evidence that their actions would be effective, and even in spite of the fact that those actions might cause great harm. So it cautioned that Institute of Medicine report that public officials had a responsibility to communicate very clearly with the public the limited evidence base for these measures and the costliness of them. So that's a kind of background of the state of, you can say, science, because these were scientific documents. They were studies conducted by teams of people surveying all the available evidence concerning non-pharmaceutical interventions before COVID.
Mm-hmm. I'd love for us to also take a second to discuss what exactly, even under the best circumstances, can science tell us? What kind of knowledge can it reveal? And what I'm getting at is the sort of the normative claim that often got associated with scientific, quote, facts. And as we get into more details later, we'll see that not all of this science was, or quote, science that was coming to us was verifiable or whatever. But just to start, like, what exactly can science tell us?
Well, I mean, scientists can inform us empirically about the nature of diseases and their characteristics. It can provide evidence. Sometimes the evidence isn't particularly good, and sometimes it's uncertain. And one major question that ran through public health messaging during COVID was how to communicate uncertainty, or whether to communicate uncertainty. That became a major issue. But science can tell us, very clearly about some things, and with some range of doubt about other things. And as I've said, with respect to these pre-COVID pandemic plans, the scientific evidence suggested great uncertainty as to the effectiveness of these measures. In fact, I could just give you one other little tidbit. Well, I think we'll come to the mask issue later, but in 2019, Dr. Anthony Fauci was asked, before COVID, what should we do in the event of another pandemic? His interviewer asked him, should we wear masks? Should we do this? And Fauci immediately interjected and said, no. Don't do that paranoid stuff, referring to wearing masks. Just keep healthy, get a good night's sleep, don't drink too much, just do the normal healthy things. So he knew then, and other informed people would have known, that there was great uncertainty around those measures. So science can give us, for sure, I mean, a clear picture of some things, a less clear picture of other things, but it informs us in making policy about scientific questions, public health measures, and other things. But science can't make policy for us. So there was a fundamental flaw in the slogan, the mantra that became so common during COVID: follow the science. Policy choices about social distancing or school closures or even vaccine mandates, as opposed to the effectiveness of vaccines, raise ethical, moral questions and trade-offs about costs and benefits, winners and losers. And science can't address those questions for us. So I think there was very clearly too much investment of decision-making authority, and not just in scientists, but in narrow experts in virology and epidemiology, who were experts of course, in the nature of diseases and their spread, and the course of their pathology and so on, but did not have broad enough expertise to weigh the costs and benefits very broadly of public policy measures. And those required not just empirical judgments of a very broad sort concerning costs and benefits, but moral judgments concerning how to weigh, pandemic restrictions versus the freedom to worship on your day of worship, or freedom of association of other kinds, or restrictions on your ability to visit your ailing parent in a nursing home, or the cost of not being allowed to have funerals. Scientists can't weigh those sorts of things. Those are not scientific questions. Those are moral questions and evaluative questions about how to weigh these different value aspects of human life. And so far too much decision-making authority was vested in narrow public health experts.
And even before we get to the policy choices, but even some of the narrative steering that happened, I'd love to discuss how, as a case study, the origin of COVID and how the dynamics between Fauci and these other scientists like Anderson and Farrar display the maybe risks of associating a lot of decision power in experts versus having it disseminated into wider democratic. Can you tell us more about exactly the contention that was happening as far as understanding the origin of COVID?
Yes, it's a good and important question. I have to say, I found this aspect of it to be quite astonishing. It's a bit like a detective novel, but in any case, what we now know quite a lot because freedom of information requests have required the disclosure of emails sent privately and Slack messages. Slack being an interoffice communication tool, which I'm not familiar with. But I guess it allows people to communicate in a kind of email format within a workplace or in a network. I think often too people set it up as a kind of private network. So we have these scientist Slack messages as well. So what happened was that after the COVID pandemic was found and reported in China, a new coronavirus, a novel coronavirus, not the first. Maybe the fifth in circulation. So coronaviruses were known. A scientist by the name of Christian Anderson at the Scripps Institute in California came across a research paper from some years before, which, as he put it in these messages that we've seen, looked like a how-to manual for designing the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. By this time, they were aware of the genetic sequence of the virus, so that provided some clues. So he immediately contacted an associate and a friend of his, another epidemiologist by the name of Eddie Holmes. And we have the emails. His email message to Holmes was, "Eddie, can we talk? I need to be talked off the edge of a cliff here." The reason being that we knew the virus had originated in Wuhan, and they knew that Wuhan was home to China's leading bat coronavirus research institute. So he talks, yes, he put two and two together. Yeah, and got four. So he talked to Holmes, and they conferred. And at that point, Holmes got in touch with Jamie Farrer, who's head of the Wellcome Trust, I think the biggest non-U.S. funder of health research in the world. It's a large health funding charity trust in the U.K. Farrer is very well known. He was promoted after this whole episode to be director of medical research at the World Health Organization. He immediately got in touch with Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins. Collins, of course, was Dr. Fauci's boss at the National Institutes of Health. Fauci headed the National Institutes of Allergic and Infectious Diseases within the National Institutes of Health. And they hurriedly arranged a phone call with Anderson and others. They enlisted about 12 other scientists who were experts in this area. And we don't have the details of the phone call, but we do have the Slack messages that these scientists were sending to one another. This included Andrew Rambo, who was a professor, I believe, at Tulane, Robert Geary, I think at Tulane. I can't remember the exact institutions these people were at. But in any case, in the midst of these conversations about the origins of the virus and the question of whether it emerged from this lab.
And this was happening January
this is
2020?
The very end of, I believe it's January 31st, 2020. Yeah, so the end of January and then very early February. Dr. Fauci and Collins urged these scientists that they should put their thoughts in a publishable paper, and indeed that they should contact the FBI if they thought that the virus had emerged from a lab. There was some discussion of levels of proof that were required, and indeed a sort of a standard of criminal proof was set out beyond a reasonable doubt, which was a bit surprising. So it was just a scientific hypothesis. It wasn't a criminal charge. But in any case, in the midst of this conversation, it seems that Anderson and Holmes and others decided that they would publish a paper arguing that the virus did not emerge from the lab, but rather emerged, that the preponderance of evidence suggested that it emerged from nature. That was the nature of the Proximal Origins article that they published just a few weeks later. And actually, draft versions were published online even in, I think, mid to late February, that same year. However, while resolving to publish an article arguing that the virus emerged from nature, from a pangolin or a raccoon dog, these were the suspects later, but emerged likely from nature rather than from the lab, they were sending each other messages saying things like, and this is a quotation, it's just so friggin' likely it came from the lab. And also saying things like, I hate it when science is politicized, but it's just impossible not to in this circumstance. And another one said, imagine the shit show if someone suggested that the Chinese had originated the virus in a lab, even if it was an accident. Of course, no one suggested it was anything other than an accident, really. But in any case, those were the messages they were sending each other. They did publish an article. Anderson himself described it as attempting to disprove a lab origin for the virus. We describe all of this in the relevant chapter. And that article was widely cited. It was touted by doctors Fauci and Collins as if they had no knowledge of it, just as a sort of independent piece of evidence suggesting that the virus originated in nature. And then, of course, it turned out that Christian Anderson had a grant proposal awaiting approval from the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Fauci was the last person to sign off on it, which he did in April, I believe. And I think the grant was approved in May of 2020. That may not have been the motive, but the fact is that was pending. What's equally astonishing about all this is that, it's a vexed question. And I don't think there's certainty, but actually some people do feel there's certainty on the other side, or virtual certainty, is that the extent to which the question, which is important, is still not being treated fairly. On February 21st this year, 2025, Nature published a commentary with the headline that evidence is building for natural origin for COVID. They quoted 6 scientists in that commentary, all 6 of them proponents of the natural origin, and they included Christian Anderson and various of his co-authors. And those are the only people that the Nature commentary publishes. They don't quote or cite or discuss anyone on the other side. So it's entirely one-sided. And if anything, I think any sober-minded examination of the evidence would suggest that the opinion among scientists has been switching in favor of a lab origin, just as the FBI and the CIA and others have drawn that conclusion with some, not certainty, but some level of certainty. So it's misleading and one-sided, and I don't see how a credible scientific journal could have published a commentary like that unless it was engaging in a political argument, in effect, not a scientific argument. And so that's very worrisome. And Nature is a leading scientific journal. When our colleagues at Princeton here publish in Nature, that's considered a real, kudo. Looks really good on their resumes. So it's supposed to be an objective scientific journal. But this issue has been highly politicized. It remains politicized, and that Nature commentary is further evidence that persists.
Yeah, there's obviously some shady things going on, but what difference would it make if it came from a lab versus if it came from the natural evolution of a virus like this? Like, what could have been the political motivations or the conflict of interest motivations that would have spurred this change in direction and significant shift to consistently support a nature-based evolution of the virus?
Right. I mean, one background matter is that this gain-of-function research, which was being conducted.
And can you define
yes.
that for our listeners? Yeah.
Yeah, gain-of-function research is research that's done on viruses, and what it does is experiment on ways of function being gained. The functions that are gained are transmissibility and virulence. So the capacity of viruses to spread more quickly or to make us sicker. I mean, those are the functions that gain-of-function research is most concerned with. And of course, those are the functions that are most concerning to us in terms of our worries about serious illness. So this gain-of-function research, which has been conducted for some time, is controversial. It's controversial among scientists. There are fundamental questions about whether the risks are worth the benefits. Doctors Fauci and Collins of National Institutes of Health and National Institutes of Allergic and Infectious Diseases, both former directors of those for decades, they're the defenders of this kind of research, that its risks are worth the benefits. They co-published an op-ed in the Washington Post in 2011 defending this research. There are a number of other scientists who have suggested it's not worth it. So there's that big background question about whether we really have enough to gain from making viruses more virulent and more dangerous to us. The thought being, I think, that we can anticipate treatments. There are also viruses that infect animals, including pigs that we consume. So there are also agricultural, I think, spin-offs from this kind of research. So it does have a legitimate purpose in trying to anticipate treatments, and it may have contributed to some progress. I'm not sure about that, but viruses have leaked before, and the Wuhan lab was known to have inadequate biosafety standards. That's one of the things that's discussed by these scientists in their Slack messages. Like something that Doctors Collins and Fauci were informed of. Biosafety level 2, which has been analogized to your dentist's office, and being quite inadequate. And Fauci and Collins expressed surprise that that was the case. And actually, scientists in these private messages we have said that when they're applying for grants, they downplay the Chinese involvement, but don't worry, we can do the research much cheaper in Wuhan. One of the reasons they can do it much cheaper in Wuhan is because the safety standards are more lax. But in any case, another aspect to this that's obviously implicated people's interests, and not just quite apart from the public interest in having the truth, is that it does appear that the National Institutes of Health and the National Institutes of Allergic Infectious Diseases did fund research in the Wuhan lab indirectly through something called the EcoHealth Alliance, which is a nonprofit in New York City that helps to support various kinds of health-related research, so that was also a factor here. There are there's emails informing Dr. Fauci of this fact of the funding via EcoHealth Alliance, and this may well have been another factor that played into their reluctance to have the origins of the virus tied to the lab. And more and more evidence has leaked out about this, but that certainly implicated American government officials in helping to fund what was evidently dangerous research. Whether it led to this specific virus or not, there are some people that feel quite confident that research of the sort that people were seeking to do may well have led to it. There was a grant proposal called to the defense to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Association, I think that's what it's called, or agency rather, which sought funding to create a virus much like the coronavirus, which was not funded. I believe it was in 2017, but there's speculation that the scientists who made the grant proposal may have gone ahead and done it anyway, because that grant proposal, again, appears to be very similar to the manipulations that are evident in the novel coronavirus itself. So we have a chapter on this, and it's an evolving story, but it's important, both because of the sake of asking whether we were told the whole truth about these matters, but also because the research itself is a matter of public interest. There are scientists who think that the dangers of creating a virus that would be even more transmissible or even more deadly than COVID, and certainly there have been a number of them, is a great threat to humanity, on a par with nuclear war or nuclear weapons. So these are matters of ongoing public interest, which we need to understand. I mean, obviously, if COVID emerged from a lab leak and research, that was manipulating viruses to make them more transmissible and more deadly, that itself changes the nature of the story, and the public has an interest in knowing for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the pandemic, as I remember it, was geared towards trusting the experts on what they were. And now with this story, it's like, oh, the experts might not have had our best interest in mind. There were these competing interests. What is to be gained or lost by transferring power and sort of absolute trust to experts when it comes to policymaking?
Yeah, look, we need experts to inform policymaking. There's no question about that. We're not skeptical about expertise. We believe in expertise. We ourselves are scholars. We study things. We study them hard. we pondered, difficult and hard questions, at least tried to, for the sake of getting a clearer view of public policy questions and also value questions. I'm a political theorist. I think we understand justice better than we used to. I think we understand various dimensions, moral dimensions of public life better than we used to. And of course, we also understand empirical dimensions of public life better than we used to. So when it comes to economics or science or public health, political science, and so on, we believe in expertise for sure. But in some cases, experts will have their own interests in stake, and that certainly could be the case in particular agencies where experts can have vested interest in the power and the authority of an agency. It's also the case that experts will have a profound interest in protecting their own reputations in the face of possible suggestions of error. The currency of scholarly expertise and expertise generally is reputational, so that also is a powerful motive. Working on the book, I went back to a book by Cecil LeBach called Lying, and it's well worth having a look back at. I think it was published in the 1980s, maybe revised in the early 1990s. It was really written in the wake of the Vietnam War and Watergate, there were military experts and geopolitical experts that were involved in shaping Vietnam War policy, and they also weren't telling the whole truth about the state of the war. She regarded that and treats it as a policy folly. And the COVID epidemic has some similar characteristics. Experts, are informative about various important matters, but when it comes to something as complex as making public policy on COVID, a very wide range of experts need to be consulted, and representatives of the public also need to be consulted. I mean, because in a way, effective compliance with public health measures requires public buy-in, and representatives of the public are much better able to gauge the impact of policies on people's ordinary lives, the burdens that they have to bear, the costs that they have to bear, and whether the gains are worth the costs. And they can consider it from the point of view of the losers as well as elite experts. So I would also say, clearly in our own politics now, the education divide it helps to inform and reinforce the political divide. Progressives tend to be associated with the Democratic Party. Educated elites tend to be associated with the Democratic Party. So I think there's a special worry now about expertise becoming confused with partisanship, and experts being less willing to criticize perhaps members of their own party. And since that education divide cuts along the partisan divide to a great extent, I think we need to be extra more careful that we're not being partisan and that we're being objective. But as a general matter, with the expertise, even aside from the politicization stuff, there's an old line which says that experts should be on tap but not on top. Public officials need to be the ones to weigh the whole range of public values at stake and to make practical decisions about the costs and benefits of public policies.
Well, and also I'm curious if it's also a focus of the responsibility too, in that if you have all these different experts who are representing information that, like we've said, science can tell us a lot, but it isn't always precise, or it's sometimes ambiguous. We can't always make enormous claims off of the studies. And so in maintaining a wider view and having the democratically elected official taking the responsibility for the end choice, then there's actually a way to process in the event that things were misrepresented, someone is held responsible for it.
Well, that's true. And of course, public officials will often want not to be held responsible, so may seek to evade their responsibility. And I think that's partly what happened with COVID as well. They were happy to offload responsibility onto scientists so they didn't have to take the responsibility themselves. So it was a kind of responsibility evasion exercise. I think that's clearly part of it. There's a special problem or issue with public health, which is that, in fact, I was just reading some things that were making this point that a scientist at Stanford, made the point at the end of 2020, looking back at some of his colleagues who had criticized the mainstream strategies, Dr. John Ioannidis and Jay Bhattacharya among them. and he's critical of them. This scholar that I'm thinking about, and he said, public debate in science is valuable. Science needs debate, but when you're talking about public health measures, debate in public can undermine people's confidence in public health measures. There needs to be consistent messaging. And I think that was part of what went on here, which is that when it comes to public health, the thought is that for public guidances to be effective, they need to be unambiguous, clear, and categorical. And that's inconsistent with, or may be inconsistent with, or may thought to be inconsistent with being honest about the uncertainties and the nuances and the possible downsides, perhaps particularly for certain segments of the population. So, I think one of the fundamental questions to come out of the debate is: do public health experts and other experts in making policy nevertheless owe the public the truth, the whole truth, about the uncertainties and the possible downsides? We quote a doctor at University of Pennsylvania Medical Center, part of the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, Dr. Paul Offit, who's written quite a lot on these measures, and he was on one of the boards that approved vaccines and made recommendations on vaccines. He was a dissenter from some of their recommendations on COVID boosters. But he's quite emphatic in looking back on COVID to say we lost a lot of public trust by not being honest with people about uncertainty and not being clear with people that, there were some side effects, some risks of side effects of the vaccines for some segments of the population. It appears young males in particular. By not being honest about these things, people had other ways of finding out the truth. There's lots of online platforms that publish these findings. And so his conclusion, and we agree with it, is that the best policy, the most respectful policy, and the policy that experts owe the public is to tell the whole truth with nuance. And that includes levels of uncertainty and possible risks. I think a lot of trust has been squandered by not being frank with the public, not treating the public as people who are owed the truth.
And have the capacity to manage it.
And have the capacity to make their own decisions. Now, mistakes might be made and so on. And you can understand in a sense, there were certainly paternalistic motives here, but also motives of public concern. But we feel strongly that no one authorized these public health officials to lie to the public, first of all, to mislead the public, to not tell the whole truth. And I just don't think they have the right to take this power onto themselves. So we think truth-telling with nuance is what public health officials owe the public.
Yeah, and let's look at masks as an example of this dynamic of public health officials making choices without necessarily being honest about the previous research or the ambiguity of previous research. I'd also, as we get into the mask thing, can we just start with why do surgeons wear masks? It seems very logical. You're like, when I go to a hospital, the surgeon wears a mask. And so tell us how that plays a role into all of this happening here.
Yes, indeed. And indeed, one of my colleagues here at Princeton, when I was talking to that colleague about the book and including the mask discussion, his response to me was, in fact, we were talking about an op-ed by Bret Stephens in the New York Times, which responded to another colleague here, but the Bret Stephens column was something to the effect that the science is not clear on masks. And the colleague said to me, I want Bret Stephens the next time he has surgery to tell his surgeon not to bother to wear a mask. So the point of surgical masks is mainly to prevent blood from spattering in the mouth and or sneezing into a wound and that sort of thing. It's not meant to protect against the spread of viruses. And COVID virus is very small. So surgical masks are really not about preventing the spread of viruses. There is some controversy in the empirical evidence of whether they're effective at all and what they do. But in any case, I think that's why surgeons wear surgical masks. It's not about the spread of viruses. So in all of the evidence, of these pre-pandemic plans, there are discussions of masks. And, the one thing they say about the masks and the WHO plan, the Johns Hopkins and other ones, is that, there's mechanistic plausibility. Just sort of thinking about the mechanism of sneezing, breathing, coughing, that sort of thing. It's mechanistically plausible that wearing a mask would make a difference. The problem is that that COVID is, I don't know, I've used this metaphor. It's not a very pleasant one, but I think in some ways it's more like smoke than like spit. It hangs in the air. The particles are very small. It can be transmitted on droplets, but it's aerosolized. So it's not only transmitted in droplets. And this was pointed out by Michael Osterholm, way back at the beginning of of the um, the pandemic, and it's why Anthony Fauci said what he did about masks being paranoid stuff in 2019. So in the pre-pandemic plans, masks are always discussed, and it's always suggested while there's mechanistic plausibility, there's no good evidence to support their effectiveness. And indeed, there's this outfit called the Cochrane Library, which is in the business of surveying scientific evidence. It surveys the available evidence on various scientific questions. It doesn't conduct the evidence. It surveys the evidence that's available and does meta-analyses. And it's done 5, I think, different editions of this on masks, in particular, mask wearing to stop respiratory pandemics and other non-pharmaceutical interventions. And it had another report, another update of its review on masking and other measures ready to go in the spring of 2020. But the overall editor of the journal delayed it on the thought that it would, again, interfere with public health messaging. Well, why? Because on masking, the Cochrane Library review says the evidence is unclear. We lack good evidence that mask wearing is effective at the population level at curbing death and serious illness from diseases. So eventually that was published, and that's what it said. This did lead to warring op-eds in the New York Times. The one was published by Bret Stephens, another by sociology colleague here, Zeynep Tufekci. The title of her op-ed, and it may have been selected by the editors of the op-ed page rather than by Professor Tufekci, was that the science is clear that masks work. But the science isn't clear that masks work at the population level. And in fact, a couple of studies that were conducted under COVID, a huge one in Bangladesh involving hundreds of thousands of people actually in different villages, unfortunately was corrupted in the course of the study, and the findings are inconclusive. My colleagues here is methodologically very sophisticated, went through the appendix of that study, which is like 60 or 70 pages long in great detail, and found that people had dropped out of the study, corrupting the results. The flaws of that study have been pointed out. So the science around mask wearing remains unclear. And the way that my colleague Frances puts it, co-author Frances puts it, is that we can't reject the null hypothesis. I'm sure she probably used that phrase.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a good phrase. Yeah, but it means that we can't reject the no effect. The evidence does not allow us to reject the conclusion that there's no effect, and that remains the case around masking. And lots of people pointed this out at the beginning. Rachel Maddow pointed this out on the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon when he asked her about it. Ed Yong said this on NPR, that National Public Radio, that an N95 mask tightly worn, which has to be really form fitted, so you only breathe through the mask. Very tightly worn. Even that's only 95% effective, and very few people wear those kinds of masks consistently and properly. Over the course of time, people's patience with those sorts of things wanes considerably. So the long-term effectiveness of these things is unproven, and frankly unlikely when one thinks about it. I mean, just how many people do you remember that had the mask down under their noses and so on, and everybody's breathing around them. I mean, so the evidence is inconclusive on masks. It at least is inconclusive. And look, so what we'll wind up concluding is more or less what Bret Stephens did, that individual mask wearing, certainly wearing it carefully, wearing it tight fitting, changing it frequently, because you need to do that. You're only supposed to wear them once. Sure, go ahead. Absolutely. The individuals have individual reasons for it, and in individual cases, it may well be effective. But there's no evidence at the population level, and therefore there was a very weak case for mask mandates, is basically what we think.
Well, Professor Macedo, so I'm really enjoying this conversation. There is so much information to glean, to research, and if this is a surprise, if these are surprising messages, if these are not surprising messages, your book details so much more of the actual research. So I highly recommend readers to go and check that out. But I want to conclude our conversation with a question that's a little bit more about the individual position towards academia or the quote experts, policy, media, just an internal disposition of this is kind of a sickening amount of information. And when COVID came, it's a terrifying thing, right? It's this aerosolized or even mystery disease that's floating around. You don't know how you're going to get it. You don't know how you're going to give it. You don't want to go kill your grandma, but you also don't want to be killed by somebody else. And just the heightened fear definitely played a role. But as far as what you might give advice to a person trying to engage with their community and politically, what is a stance or a position that they could take internally to help them navigate the fact that there's constantly ambiguous terms being presented as definite guidelines? There's consistently ulterior motives in the messaging that may or may not be making it to them. And maybe just some advice on what to do with the mess of it.
Yeah, it's a that's a very tough one. I would say that the two big themes of the book. I say one thing, if you want to think about these sorts of issues with respect to the COVID pandemic, you should read our book called "In COVID's Wake," Princeton University Press.
Out March
Macedo
11th.
and Lee, out March 11th. Yes, very very modestly priced and well worth it. An excellent gift item too for your friends. But in any case. I did find that with this particular topic, and I think this is perhaps more polarized than other topics. I think that, President Trump was in the White House. This is very high profile. States diverged quite a lot on COVID policy, but, we do worry that this is a window onto partisanship in science more broadly. And I do think that the public health officials and other experts have not been entirely frank about various matters, and we're still not being entirely frank about costs and benefits of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, school closures and so on, and virus origins and various other matters. So on some of these issues that are highly politicized, I don't have particularly good advice except to seek out a variety of sources. We certainly found that there were various blogs and Substacks that wound up being extremely helpful. There's a group called U.S. Right to Know, which did lots of freedom of information requests, and basically publishes the results of their freedom of information requests, and that's extremely illuminating, I think, to see original documents. That can be quite helpful. There were particular sources on COVID. Who were very very good, and on other topics there'll be other people. But I would say that consulting a variety of sources, I'll just say this, and it won't do me any good reputationally, but I just decided when President Trump was elected, I didn't vote for him, wouldn't vote for him every time, and after January 6th, I would never vote for him, and can't see why anyone would. But in any case, let me just say that when he was elected, I just decided that every night I watched the news, I was going to watch Fox News for a while too. Because they're not wrong about everything, and other networks may not be quite as partisan, but MSNBC is about as partisan on the other side, so I think variety is helpful. On COVID, we found that something like the Daily Telegraph in the UK, which is more right leaning, was helpful on COVID. Now, I think they've not been very good on some other things. There's certainly a bias on the conservative side, and maybe worse in some cases. But I think a variety of sources is one way to go, and then to in some cases to seek out more subject matter experts who are. There's a Substacker in who's I best based in France, Paul D. Thacker, who's used to work for the Washington Post, and he's been excellent on COVID issues. He's really calls it the Disinformation Chronicle, and he's just done some wonderful work, his own investigative reporting. Sometimes he's drawing on other people, of course, but he's been terrific. U.S. Right to Know has been absolutely terrific on the lab origins business. They've published lots of these emails. They've done freedom of information requests. So on other issues, I'm not sure who the experts are, but I will say that blogs and Substacks have been an invaluable source of information for us. Uh, and there are unfortunately, it does take some digging because it's a much more diverse range of voices that are out there.
Well, thank you so much for your input, Professor Macedo.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. Professor Macedo and Professor Lee's book, In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us, is available on March 11th of 2025. And if you have additional questions or think this was heresy or loved it, go pick up the book and read their arguments in a much more generous time frame than a 2-hour podcast series. If you want more content like this, make sure to follow us on your preferred listening platform and find us on social media under the James Madison Program. Madison's Notes is researched, hosted, produced, edited, and engineered by yours truly. And if you have comments or ideas for future guests or episodes, feel free to reach out to me through the James Madison Program social media. I'm Laura Laurent, and thank you for tuning in on this episode of Madison's Notes.